Irish Swede, and we are going to go over the Destiny. I really don't want to call it a debate. I cannot genuinely call it a debate.
It was a thing that happened.
It was a thing that happened on the internet that involved two people talking. Well, it mostly involved one person talking. And I really don't think it's any more than that. Like, okay, we don't... What I'd like to do, in an ideal world, is I'd like to sit down and I'd like to go over the debate point by point and offer commentary. We don't have that kind of time, though. So, instead, me and Swede have both watched the debate. I've watched it twice now. And Swede, I believe you've watched it once?
Once, and I survived.
And you survived. So, let's go ahead and start out with what were your takeaways from the debate? And while you're giving those, everybody in chat, have you seen the debate with Destiny and Richard Wolf? Have you guys already watched this so that you have context for what we're about to go through?
So when I watched it yesterday and today, because I had to split it up between two because my ears were bleeding pretty hard after the first try to go through it. It was, you could tell that it was an academic who was approaching this like he walked into a classroom and wanted to talk to the audience rather than actually talking to Destiny or battling Destiny as you would normally in a debate situation. It was very much a situation in which Richard Wolf had the idea to come in and educate. He treated it like a classroom. Destiny treated it like a debate, talked very quickly, brought up a lot of points very quickly, almost in a Gish Gallop sense. And kind of overwhelmed Richard because he really wanted to break things down point by point and really get into the nitty-gritty details of how everything works. So, and then you couple the fact with that Richard Wolf is a ideologue Marxist, like dyed to the wool. You run into several problems in that he's great at criticizing capitalism, but manufacturing what should happen post-capitalism in a post-capitalistic world, socialism, communism, whatever, syndicalism, whatever it is, he kind of gets into a rut of only what's in the Communist Manifesto. And it's very dry. And it doesn't work very much for arguments because the Communist Manifesto, along with Lenin and Mao and everything else, has been bastardized and everything along those lines to the point where none of us really take tankies seriously anymore because the truth has come out about what happened in the USSR and currently what China is like. In that, so Wolf is kind of stuck in the past, and it's kind of sad.
So my takeaway from it largely was that Wolf walked in to try to be an educator, for better or worse. Destiny walked in wanting to win. And I think Destiny won the debate. And I hate saying that because I don't agree with Destiny. You know, I am an ally to liberals and liberalism up until the point where we've managed to democratize the workplace, where we've managed to get things to a point where, you know, workers and their employers do not have an antagonistic relationship. Basically by removing the employer's part of that. But I ended up, after watching the debate, going, no, while I agreed with more of what Richard said to an extent, I don't think he won. I think Destiny won. And there were a few points that really did not help. One of them was that he started out with 3 definitions of socialism. Destiny wanted to talk about one definition of socialism. Wolf brought up 3. And I think that automatically colored the debate. Because that happened very early on. I think that automatically colored the debate very, very weirdly going forward. Because what do you do when instead of having one definition to talk about, you're given 3, and during the course of that, all Destiny seemed to do was say, no, everything you just said was just capitalism. Like, to me, these are the things I don't agree with Destiny on. I don't agree with Destiny that all of the things that he said are capitalism. Like, Destiny said markets are capitalism. You can't have markets outside of capitalism, which is weird because you had markets in slavery, you had markets in feudalism, and then he would get upset. Like he seemed to have this like weird rule that if my opponent brings up feudalism, they lose. No, feudal. If you're going to talk about the progression of economic systems, it makes sense to bring up feudalism. That is a thing that happened in the past. There's no real way around that. So, I think the biggest thing though, there was a point near the end of the debate that made me go, "Oh no, you just lost everybody, Wolf. You just lost everybody." And it was when Lance, the host of the debate, proposed a question: what happens in socialism if I want a PS5? I want a PlayStation 5. So I want a good or commodity right now that enriches my life in some way. And Wolf gave this long diatribe, and I can't tell if he was serious. I feel like he was, about how you would go to your foreman and you would propose the question to the rest of the workers in your sector that you would like a personal PS5, and then all of them would have to deliberate with one another over whether or not it was viable to grant you, a single individual, a PlayStation 5 for personal use. That just sounded so fucking absurd to me.
That's where we get into the dogmatic Marxism and the Communist Manifesto and the way the USSR worked. And that was kind of the problem with how Richard opened is their initial talk was about how the USSR, you really, it's hard to bring up the USSR as a success story because of the Gulag system. I mean, they literally built their economy on the back of slaves, just as the United States did. And there was still markets. It was, I know it's a meme at this point, but the USSR was more state capitalism than it was anything else. The workers did not have full and proper representation. One of the things that really defines socialism itself is the workers own the means of production. If and only if it's done through the state, every worker must have one worker, one vote. I mean, you can go to the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy, and I know I'm appealing to that right now, but it's a very good system. It's a very good definition that you can start from. Like, most socialist systems do not involve state ownership. In fact, most of them try to end the state itself. You have anarcho-syndicalism, you have an anarcho-socialist, you have market socialism, in which you break out the state itself, or the state only serves certain focuses. You can have a federated socialist system, either through syndicalism or just federated socialism, where you have all these different variations of one thing, but they all come back to one major thing. Every worker must have the ownership and the democratization of the workplace, either their own workplace where they work directly, or through all workplaces through equal representation through the state, whether it's federated or not. That was my prime example. So right when they started off, like with Destiny's Open, I would have just from where Richard went right in the open, I would have immediately hammered him on the fact that your entire opening was killed because you said something about markets not existing outside of capitalism, and they do, and they can. So please restate your opening without bringing markets into the equation, and watch him squirm.
I think that holdup, the idea that markets only exist within capitalism, it feels weird. And there was a point in it where, like, I forget the exact wording, but Destiny said to Wolf, no, this is economics 101, or something like that. And as soon as he said that, I wanted to throw a book. I just wanted to throw a book and go, yeah, that's economics 101. Do you know what happens when you get into higher levels of economics? They tell you to forget all the shit in economics 101.
As someone who graduated with a degree in it, I can vouch for that. Let's take labor markets, for example. Labor, you look at the marginal benefit, marginal cost, and if you impose a minimum wage, it's supposed to create unemployment or supposed to create shortages or overages in supply of labor. You learn that only works if all other things being equal, and the only change is the minimum wage. Well, it's not the only thing that's equal, because worker productivity changes. turnover changes and employment costs due to turnover changes and all these other things change. So you have these myriad of other variables. And so whenever anybody ever claims, oh, it's Econ 101, you immediately discount them because you have to take a look at, okay, what are all the examples and variables that they are not controlling for? If it's a monovariant causation, immediately stop listening to them.
Well, because Econ 101 is mainly concerned with supply and demand, and that's basically where the buck stops.
The supply and demand in the PPC. So the PPC is where like the United States can produce wheat really cheaply, but it can't catch fish very well. Norway can catch fish really well, but there's really no place to grow wheat. So that's why you have globalization of trade networks. Norway fishes, trades us for wheat.
Well, just like we can grow beef very easily here, but in Japan there's less land to grow beef on, so we can grow a lot of beef. But again, like Japan, it's easier for them to fish because they're locked in water.
Yeah, pretty much. So that's another principle of macro. And then when you get into micro, you get into some other concepts. But it all surrounds the MBMC curves, and that gets that again when you only look at that, that's a monovariant causation. And how many things in life are monovariant? Just
video games. That it exists in the realm of video games. That's about it. But yeah. I think that's kind of the point. So I don't know what I'd like to do. Like I said, is I'd like to go through and cover the entire debate, but I'll likely have to do that at a different point.
I'd be happy to do that when I've got more time too, because there was a lot of things said, especially from the instance of Destiny, where he's fighting against the examples that Richard brings up, and the examples that Richard brings up are incredibly. They're easy to refute, because if you bring up Russia, or if you bring up China, or if you bring up Cambodia
was weird as well to bring up, or Mondragon.
Yeah. Well, and even you can sit back and say the anprims, such as Cambodia, are another pimple on the face of communism and socialism, a really big one. Vietnam is one that always gets brought up as well, that they had to make market reforms. Well, that's fine, and all well and good, but it's all in the context of what was this a transitionary point? Were they giving the workers more and more power over time? Was it a state capitalist situation in which they were trying to get to the dictatorship of the proletariat and then switch over to low communism? Were they trying for a socialist system? Were they trying for something else? What was the end goal that they were trying for? And then how much did a world power known as the stupid North American country as the US, did they interfere?
I know that.
So what were the? Or go ahead.
I was going to say, I know during the debate, Destiny brought up Venezuela as one of the failures of socialism, and when he brought that up, I actually didn't hear Richard say anything about the United States' hand in that at all. And
well, there are a whole bunch of causes to the Venezuela question, and one of the major ones is the cronyism within the government that Hugo Chavez created. And so the oil companies, most of the executives and the engineers left that were running the now state-controlled oil companies, and he basically staffed them with his buddies that he needed to keep a watch over and make happy, rather than based upon the expertise. So he created just a monster of its own making through corruption and cronyism. And that's, you face that in any economy, where the state has that level of power, or you have a dictator, or you have an oligopoly where you just cannot work against the amount of power given to appoint people like that, rather than having the workers, have the power itself. Because when you have a company that's owned by the workers, that doesn't mean a CEO doesn't exist. You appoint a CEO through the workers that is able to take care of those day-to-day things that a CEO or a CFO does.
Because you still have to have, because CEO doesn't mean owner. Currently, CEOs have undue power and have undue wages. So when I say I'm against CEOs, I'm against our current conceptualization of CEOs. That
That's fair.
when I say that, that's my point. But when you have a democratized workplace, which the only example that Richard seemed to bring up during the debate was Mondragon. When you have a democratized workplace, you have every single position is determined by the workers, as opposed to having just a single person who goes, no, we're going to bring this one person up through the company or hire somebody for this position. The workers can actually democratically decide this thing. Every worker has some level of vote and some level of ownership, and this is distinct because one of the things Destiny tried to do during the debate was try to point out that everything Richard said was capitalism. So if Richard brings up worker ownership of the means of production, Destiny goes, well, that already happens in capitalism. We call it owning stocks. And as somebody who's worked for companies that like basically forced people to have stocks by being part of the company, that is not the same thing as being in a democratized workplace. Merely having a small level of ownership through private stocks is not the same thing as actually having a margin of power where you are.
Yeah, well, and when people, go if you go to like finance.yahoo.com and you look at any particular stock and you look at their market capitalization, which is the total value, is the value of the stock times the number of shares available, you can see, there's billions of shares, that are floating out there in the market.
Never
And if you get
look a
100,
tulip in the eye.
that's tears on a river, as Kenny Wayne Shepherd would tell you. And I just aged myself there. and, and so it's one of those things where, okay, if you go and work for a company that has 5,000 employees, you are now one vote out of 5,000 rather than 100 votes out of 3 billion. It's a completely different scenario in what you're talking about. The amount of power that one person has in the first situation versus the second situation is immense. And to say that you can have a socialist company within the bounds of capitalism. We have several, actually. You could say credit unions are actually a little bit socialist. You could say farmers cooperatives are socialist. You could say the workers cooperatives and communes that are around the country are socialist or even communist at this point in time. So you can have those aspects within a capitalist framework, but that doesn't mean that you're in a socialist framework. So that was one of those where Wolf could have turned around and just nailed him to a tree on that one, and again watched him squirm, because there's so much whataboutism of, well, what about the farmers cooperative system? We have that already. Okay, and what? So what?
It's like
So, yeah.
there are individual people in the United States right now who illegally own slaves. It's whether they are sex slaves, whether they are slaves as workers, this stuff goes undocumented, and it's definitely a rarity. But merely having people who abuse others within a system does not mean that the system that they're operating in is still a slave system, outside of the concept of wage slavery, which is something that wasn't brought up during the debate at all, so I'm not going to talk about wage slavery right now.
Yeah, and Jaguar, I wouldn't say that they both agreed with socialism. Richard Wolff is much more of a communist and a dogmatic Marxist. Destiny is much more of just a straight up liberal, where his Mott and Bailey tactic is to point out the evils of capitalism and then back away from actual real structural change and say, no, let's be pragmatic in what we can actually accomplish within our lifetimes. And not thinking that there are several ways that we could actually achieve a modicum of actual structural change to socialism within our lifetimes through various ways. One of those ways is syndicalism. You could have the rise of worker organization through unions, and have those unions eventually just take over the workplace itself. Everybody votes one person, one vote through the union, and the union actually is the one that distributes the pay and decides everything. You just have a federated system through that method. This could happen in the next 50 years. God will, or I say God willing, but God willing that I live another 50 years, given my current state of health, I would love to see something like that. So there's I wouldn't say that they agree. at all. And the fact of the matter is that neither one of them could come to a consensus on what even socialism even was within the thing that happened that we're talking about. Because I don't even know what that thing is.
Destiny deliberately would not be able to come to an agreement on what socialism is, because part of his tactic, and it's there in his opening, one of the 4 things he points out is that he's not been given a cogent definition of what socialism is, and that's so he could not put forth a cogent definition of socialism because it would undermine his opening statement. So I can at least understand why he wouldn't. I don't think it's dishonest or anything if your opener is contingent on you not having that definition and wanting your opponent to provide that definition, as opposed to trying to define it for them. But like I said at the beginning, Richard began with 3 different definitions of socialism instead of, well, just running with one and going with it. We had something similar to this happen in a debate that me and Dr. Josh Bowen, when we were debating slavery against Praise and Jill, when we were debating them, they said, the atheists need to give a definition of slavery so that they can operate. And several times, Josh tried to give a definition of slavery and wasn't able to because he kept getting interrupted. That's not necessarily what happened here. What happened here was Wolf just giving so many definitions, and then Destiny rejecting all those definitions and just saying those are all capitalism, though, without really understanding that if the means and modes of production are completely democratically controlled and not controlled by private investors, that stopped being capitalism a while ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just like, in 700 AD, roughly when capitalism started to get its roots, in Florence, Venice, through the guild systems, I guess is what we would call proto-capitalism. We didn't say that they stopped being feudalistic until private investors and non-hereditary rulers became the mode of production. So it's a very disingenuous way to do things. So I wouldn't stand for him trying to do that. I would have tried to have nailed him down and say, hey, look, if every workplace is democratized, then it's socialist, period.
There's a thing that you bring up there, though, about the different mercantile guilds within feudalism. So, hold on, I had a point, and it actually just went away. My brain, I hate when my brain does that. There was something about mercantile feudalism that just made it, I had a point, and then it just went. This is why I am not good at debates anymore. My brain loses things.
The system itself gave rise to the merchant class, which was a free class of peoples that ended up having to be part of a guild system. And that guild system was not a real democratization. However, if it did become a democratized part of it, we could have skipped straight to socialism. But it was, in essence, the planting of the seed of this hereditary system that we currently have should give rise more to a quote unquote meritocratic or non-hereditary system of wealth transfer, which ended up being what we call now capitalism. It's just feudalism that's non-hereditary.
Now I remember what my point was. So it was on the hereditary nature of feudalism, So a fun thing that happens within capitalism right now is we end up having a sort of pseudo-feudalism anyway, because instead of having hereditary government, as it were, we do have families that, because they have generational wealth, maintain that power generationally de facto.
That is correct. However, they can easily lose that through kids that are idiots. And in most cases, and I believe I can send you a source on this, most generational wealth ends after the 3rd generation. Like, most of that power and wealth itself is gone. Now you'll come up with some counterexamples like the Johnson & Johnson family and and some others. But on the whole, you will see much more turnover as to who has that generational wealth. But that's just contrasting it with feudalism, where that quote unquote divine right sticks with the family no matter what.
Yeah. And then whenever a conversation about revolution happens, there's always the, well, what right is it what right of yours is it to unseat the king type of deal.
Yeah, and to which I respond to a lot of people saying, you know what, you were the person in 1200 AD defending feudalism, saying, well, capitalism hasn't really ever worked. It's always had to revert back to some sort of feudalistic type enterprise, and reform itself backwards a little bit, be a little bit reactionary. So it's the same people. Is second verse same as the first.
Well, and it's kind of part of the boom bust cycle of capitalism. You have modes where it desperately needs to gain in profit. Like profit motive is the bread and butter of capitalism, and when it's in one of those boom periods, it's usually aided on the back of some type of governmental intervention. But then as soon as that intervention is seen as not needed, it tends to fall into a bust cycle. Because profits on the and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it is literally impossible to have perpetually maintained profits, because you eventually hit a point where you siphon so much wealth from the working class that they do not have any more wealth to give. And you can't just print more money to solve that problem, because that lowers the value of the currency that you have, and you eventually just end up in the same situation that Germany was in when the Deutschmark, you had to use like a barrel to pay for a single loaf of bread. You end up getting to that scenario the more and more wealth you cycle out.
Well, see, the United States has a little bit is a completely different animal when it comes to that. We have what's called exorbitant privilege with our currency. So while other countries may not be able to do this, the United States certainly can. And I go back to an article that came out in February of 2020 that said for the world to settle its current accounts in the trade markets, we needed to print an additional $10 trillion instantly so that current accounts could be settled in the US dollar. Otherwise, the demand for the US dollar would spike so hard that exports from US based companies may collapse. We were already on the verge, thanks COVID, of a recession based on value of the US dollar, because there wasn't enough dollars in the world to settle current accounts. So we can literally print quite a bit more money as long as it's spread out so that the market can absorb it at some point. Mainly because the velocity has continued to fall, so that people aren't spending as much money as they were. So you don't have a dollar traversing multiple hands anymore over a year. I mean, velocity is almost down to 1.4. So a dollar only changes hands once 1.4 times during the course of a year. And most of that other money is actually going to create inflation in the stock market or other markets where the money supply is actually not counted. So you have a growth in money supply, which means everybody's in savings accounts and nobody's spending the money that is actually being printed, which means that inflation is relatively controlled. We're in a really weird situation right now where we have very bifurcated inflationary spikes, such as in lumber. You go out and buy a stud these days, and it costs $8 a board, where it usually only costs $1.75, $1.90.
Man, I have
but
I
that
have
doesn't.
no idea what the price of lumber is. I have not encountered any projects in the last 4 or 5 months that have required me to buy an immense amount of lumber. I have no idea what you're talking about.
But that's one of those weird things that it doesn't hit, but that doesn't hit the CPI. So that's one of those where like it can hurt people in how much it costs. But if you look at the CPI number, the number sits at 1.5, and you're like, well, inflation hasn't taken hold yet. Well, it has in such areas that it's actually hurting people across the board. It's just not quite as evident as it used to be. So we're redoing our bathroom right now, and luckily there's not much lumber that has to get bought. But we had to wait a week to actually some things to get in stock. We had some problems sourcing other materials, so it's really weird, and it's actually just chokes in this chain of supply. Um, Lumber companies, the mills are the choke because they actually shut down production in last April because they didn't think demand would be worth anything, and they were wrong. And so now you have a whole bunch of lumber not being produced and a whole bunch of demand for it. So you these three or four different factors flowed into it, and now you have inflation in an area that doesn't count in the quote unquote economics book of inflation. Which is very frustrating for people like you and me and everybody else that wants to go buy a board to do something. And even Ben Shapiro when he bought his 1x8x4.
I still have no idea what the point of that video was. Like I understand on a base level that's him virtue signaling. That's all it is. But like practically speaking, what are you going to? I am not convinced that Ben Shapiro has drywall screws to do anything with that. I'm not convinced that he has L brackets to do anything with that board. I do not know what the purpose of that board is. Is he just going to buy it and put it in his office?
I don't know. I mean, he could nail it to a tree, so he could put a squirrel feeder up on it.
How is he going to nail it to a tree? With what hammer? With what nails? I am not convinced he owns these things. I am not convinced he owns them. As somebody who has spent thousands of dollars on construction equipment in the last 6 months because of having to rebuild my kitchen, which, thankfully it's for the most part done. I can just sit back and cook in it. That's been a wonderful thing for the last few months. But really, honestly, truly, I had never gone into a hardware store, purchased a single thing of lumber, and then just went home and said, no, that's a day. That screws, drills, something else was needed. I know we're very off base from the conversation about Wolf and Destiny now, but
again, you and I can talk about the markets creating circumstances in which hurt us. This doesn't go away with socialism. This doesn't go away with communism. This doesn't go away with a lot of things, because where Destiny is right, and what he argued against, was the centrally planned systems that we know from the past and the pure, unadulterated social damage they caused. So, he's right to argue against that. It's just that I don't know of anybody other than tankies, who are a very small proportion of people, who are actually arguing for these things. So it's like he's creating a straw man, even though it actually exists as a subgroup of people.
And then Wolf jumps on that and stands the straw man.
Exactly, and it was frustrating to listen to. It was frustrating for Richard Wolff to sit there and stand the USSR when it was built on the backs of Gulag slave labor. For China, when that was built on the backs of tens of millions of dead people. I mean, if you want to know what central planning can do with one mistake, go read about the pigeons, or is it the swallows or the pigeons in China? Because they were eating the seeds, so Mao commanded everybody to go kill this specific bird and basically caused an extinction event. It is one of the dumbest things you'll ever read about, but it's all too common in these autocratic systems. But that doesn't mean socialism is autocratic. That doesn't mean it's not a democratic system by which people can locally organize. I mean, there's an anarchic part to all this too that was completely ignored in this quote unquote thing that happened a few days ago. The whole part that anarchy or anarchist systems were ignored, just made my skin crawl.
With that said, I think you've only got about 2 more minutes available, correct?
Yeah.
Unfortunately. So what I will say is, if you are watching this and you guys have enjoyed this discussion, going over some of the points of the debate, talking about economics, talking about stuff maybe a little more in depth than what you typically get here on the interweb.com, then please do me a favor. Go to Irish Swede's channel. When this is up on YouTube, you will see a link to his channel in the description. And there, if I actually have to give a video recommendation, there is a video about what is socialism, an actual definition of it, which I will be doing a variant on a little later, but I would highly recommend starting with that video on his channel, most certainly and definitely. And I want to thank Swede.
I just need 30 subs so I can rename my channel to The Irish Swede instead of what it currently is named when I first, signed up for YouTube. So I believe it's 100 subs.
And then you can change channel name. I think so.
Yeah. So, but other than that, I thank you for your time, everybody. I hopefully this was enlightening for some of you, and I will be putting out a new video soon. I know I haven't since probably January, but I am getting into the debate on reparations for slavery and for Native Americans. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm applying to get my PhD in economics, and my course of study is going to be the amount of value of labor that was taken from Blacks and Native Americans through their displacement, genocide, and slave labor. So it's one of those interesting topics of conversation. I will not entertain anybody who thinks that they are not owed those people. So I will be curating comments from people who think that they are not owed. But I will be going over what are some of the actual economically viable ways to pay them to those people that are certainly owed that.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much for taking your time to hop on stream today. And with that, hopefully you all enjoyed.